All right, Genesis chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. And Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his word.
Once to every man and nation comes a moment to decide in the strife of truth with falsehood, for the good or evil side. Some great cause God's new Messiah, offering each the bloom or blight. In the choice goes by forever, twixt that darkness and that light. By the light of burning martyrs, Christ, thy bleeding feet we track, toiling up new Calvary's effort, with the cross that turns not back. New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncool. They must upward still and onward. Who would keep abreast of truth?
necessarily need to have anything to say this morning after that. Thank you. This morning's presentation is entitled, Individual Rights, a Legacy of Blood. Why do we have the rights and the freedoms that we enjoy today? Building on last night's presentation, we're going to talk about individual rights and that period of time that Melissa was singing about just now, where people suffered and died and bled for the things that they believed. And before we do that, let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, we come before you here and bow our heads. Lord, help us to love the truth. We get used to lies. We live in a world of lies. It's easy to be tempted to tell lies. Lord, help us to tell the truth. Help us to love the truth. Lord, you died to give us the truth. And you died to set us free to follow the truth. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so last night we talked about the 1260-year period from 538 AD to 1798. This is biblical. And we're just talking about history, black and white. We're just going to keep it simple. During this time period, starting in 538 AD, the Bishop of Rome ascended to civil power. He took civil power. So he was a religious leader, but he also ascended to civil power. And that began the time period. And all through that 1260-year period until Napoleon attempted to conquer all of Europe. Now, he failed in that attempt. He was stopped. As prophecy said that he would be stopped. Many people have attempted to unite Europe. Charlemagne, Napoleon, Hitler, conquer it all. All of them failed because prophecy says that's never going to happen before the end. But Napoleon in 1798 sent his general into Rome because he intended to unite Europe, and he could not do that while the papal states existed. And so he sent Berthier in. They arrested the Pope. And he was sent to France, and he died in exile. And the world thought that the papacy was dead. In fact, there were newspaper articles from that time period saying, the papacy is dead, never again to rise again. So that ended that 1260-year period just as prophecy foretold. It's reliable. The Bible is reliable. You can take it to the bank. In a shifting world with shadows and uncertainty, there's one thing that you can always rely on, and that is the Word of God. Looking at some quotes here with respect to this period, because this morning what we want to look at is the history of the martyrs. We want to look at the history of the time period. Why? Just so that we can dwell on all the violence and all the blood? No. It is the price of liberty. The blood of martyrs, Tertullian said, an early church father, is seed. So that blood, even though it was shed in the cause of oppression, worked for liberty. Even though Abel was killed by his brother, his blood cried to God from the ground. And Hebrews chapter 11, that even though Abel is dead, his blood still speaks because God will avenge his own. Down through the time periods, all of the oppression and the martyrdom, the Lord is watching. Beginning with this quote here from History of the Rise and Influence of the Spirit of Rationalism in Europe. It's published in 1910. That the Church of Rome has shed more innocent blood than any other institution that has ever existed among mankind will be questioned by no Protestant who has a competent knowledge of history. So if you understand history, nobody's going to say, oh, that never happened. We live in a world where there's history revisionism. Newspaper articles that you want to find, suddenly they're gone. Important things that you want to check, all of a sudden aren't there. History is repeating itself, but the records remain with respect to this time period. The memorials, indeed, of many of her persecutions are now so scanty that it is impossible to form a complete conception of the multitude of her victims. and it is quite certain that no power of imagination can adequately realize their suffering. Now, some people might say, well, that's an exaggeration. We're going to find out. This is from J.A. Wiley from The History of Protestantism. Many Roman Catholic authors today have tried to prove that their church does not sanction persecution, but facts of history are too plain to be denied. Eternity alone will reveal what God's dear children suffered during the Dark Ages. And last night we talked about why is it called the Dark Ages. It's because the scriptures were kept from people. It's because people didn't have the Bible, and so Europe descended into darkness, superstition, and error until the light began to dawn with Huss and Jerome and Wycliffe, Luther. Accordingly, as the papacy attained to power, the common people became more oppressed until the noon of the papacy was the midnight of the world. So you can see what it's saying there. At the height of papal power, Wiley is saying that was the midnight of the world. The more power the papacy has, Wiley is saying, the less liberty there is. And this is something that we need to think about in the context of today. Again, from the history of Romanism, from the birth of popery in 606 to the present time, it is estimated by careful and credible historians that more than 50 million of the human family were slaughtered for the crime of heresy by popish persecutors, an average of more than 40,000 religious murders for every year of the existence of the papacy or popery. Okay? So this was mainstream Protestant thought. It's in the history books. Credible people don't deny it. And we're going to go through that here. Now, why persecution? Why not just live and let live? Today we live in what's sort of still a pluralistic society where you can have different viewpoints and nobody kills you for them. That's still, thank God, the world that we live in today, more or less to some extent, and I think you could debate more or less to some extent. Why persecution, though? What justifies it? Did Jesus persecute anybody? If Jesus is the head of the church, why, since he didn't persecute anybody, he never tortured anybody, never murdered anybody, right? Went around healing people, teaching, preaching the gospel of the kingdom of heaven. Why then force and coercion? This is from Augustine, former bishop of Hippo, now a saint. Of course, you've heard of Saint Augustine, sainted by the papacy. Listen to what Augustine says. Why, therefore, should not the church use force in compelling her lost sons to return? If the lost sons compelled others to their destruction, although even men who have not been compelled but only led astray are received by their loving mother with more affection if they are recalled to her bosom through the enforcement of terrible but salutary laws and are the objects of far more deep congratulation than those whom she had never lost. And what he's saying is that when you're punished, even if you're punished severely, even if you're punished with persecution, if it brings you back, the punishment is justified. It's the argument that the ends justify the means. It doesn't matter how cruel you are, as long as there's some good result, according to Augustine. Going on here, Augustine's letter number 185. It is indeed better, as no one ever could deny, that men should be led to worship God by teaching than that they should be driven to it by fear of punishment or pain. So Augustine's saying, listen, I agree with you. If you have concerns about persecution, I agree with you, he's saying. It's better to teach people in love and have them come to truth lovingly. Truth. But it does not follow that because the former course produces better men, therefore those who do not yield to it should be neglected. So you can see what Augustine is saying. Just because it's better to love people into church doesn't mean that you should neglect persecution. It's okay, says Augustine, to persecute. It's okay to torture if it brings people back. If they are compelled to come back first by fear or pain. So this is where the doctrine comes from. This is the doctrine that the Inquisition is founded on. Okay, you've heard of the Inquisition. If you haven't heard of the Inquisition, you need to study the Inquisition because that is a human fact. It's a historical fact. Went for centuries. Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands. We'll come to that momentarily here. Thomas Aquinas, another saint. All right, this person. They say he's holy. Doctrine is holy. You can pray to this man. They say. If counterfeiters of money or other criminals are justly delivered over to death forthwith by the secular authorities, much more can heretics, after they are convicted of heresy, be not only forthwith excommunicated, but as surely be put to death. So if you commit somebody to death because they counterfeit money, you're obviously justified in killing somebody because they're a heretic. And what is heresy? It means that you believe something contrary to the dogma and the orthodoxy of Rome. If you have beliefs that are based on the Bible, not on the teachings of the Pope, you are a heretic. And heretics are justifiably put to death, according to the teaching of the Church Fathers. This is from the Western Watchman, official organ of Father Phelan, 1908. The Church has persecuted. Only a tyro in church history will deny that. Protestants were persecuted in France and Spain with the full approval of the church authorities. So notice what's happening. Who's doing the persecuting ultimately? The church pronounced them a heretic, and then the state carries out the punishment. So you have a church-state combination. We have always defended the persecution of the Huguenots and the Spanish Inquisition. Pope Gregory IX made the following decree for the destruction of all heretics. He issued a ruling. It's quite lengthy. We're not going to read it all. But basically, he tells civil rulers, you have got to get rid of heretics in your country. You are to take every step necessary to exterminate people who do not believe like you. You think, well, how could this have happened? But this is the world that existed for over 1,000 years. And the world that you live in right now comes out of this history of oppression. And we forget that. We take our rights for granted. You talk to kids today, and you say to them, do you know that there was a time when there was no such thing as cell phones? And they're like, nah, we don't believe that. There was such a time when there was no such thing as cell phones. There was such a time as there was no such thing as a constitution. You didn't have inalienable rights. Your rights came from the state, and they could be taken away by the state just as easily. That is where the rights that we have come from. It comes out of a history of bloodshed and oppression. Millions dead for their faith. That is why you have freedom of speech today. That is why you have freedom of religion today. That's why we as Americans have these rights codified in the Constitution, and people take them for granted. Lord, have mercy on us. We have no idea. Many Americans have never been outside the confines of this country. You go to some of these countries, over in China, they have social credit systems. You can't get on a bus or book a hotel or get on a flight if you have a low social credit score because you have said something the state doesn't like. Over 1 billion people live like that. We take our liberties for granted, and they are fragile. They are fragile, friends. Upon February 16, 1568, a sentence of the Holy Office of the Inquisition condemned all the inhabitants of the Netherlands to death as heretics. Everybody. A proclamation of the king dated 10 days later confirmed this decree of the Inquisition and ordered it to be carried into instant execution. This is probably the most concise death warrant that was ever framed, and that's because of Protestantism. You've heard of Orange Men. That was the whole Protestant thing in the Netherlands. And there was war on those people. As I said last night, this book here, Fox's Book of Martyrs, used to be required reading for every American patriot. It was on the shelves of the people who built the cabins and the homesteads of this country. And now nobody's ever heard of it. We forget our history. We forget the truth of what happened in the past. And because of that, that means we are doomed to what? Repeat it. And it's coming, friends. It's coming. More about the history. In 1572, there was a conspiracy. At this point in time, 10% approximately, maybe less, of France was Huguenot, French Protestant. And there was a conspiracy to eradicate them. And in 1572, the order was given to kill the French Protestants in Paris. And there was a massacre that ensued. And, people have tried to gloss over what happened historically because it was centuries ago. But what does God say? The voice of your brother's blood cries to me from the grave. He does not forget. It's the same God today as lived back then. The passage of time to him is but an instant. To us, it's a long time. To him, it is a moment. According to Huguenot sources, 70,000 people lost their lives that night. And the blood ran thick over the streets and the steps of Paris. Now, some historians have gone back and they've said, well, it wasn't that many. Maybe only 2 or 3. Maybe only 5,000. Maybe only 25,000. Regardless of the numbers, it was a lot. It was a lot of dead people slain in cold blood. And when news of it reached Pope Gregory, there was a celebration. They marched in solemn procession to the church to celebrate the death of those Protestants. He minted a medal, and you can see it up there on the screen. You can see the angel of death, the destroying angel, killing French Huguenots. Struck as a medal, the slaughter of the Huguenots. A cardinal who received the news of the French Protestants massacre gave the messenger 1,000 coins, silver or gold, I can't remember which. Now, at this point in time, the French Protestants in France, they were a very successful group of people. They were in textiles, they were in many different industries. They were, according to scholars, some of the best and brightest, most industrious people of the country. And when they began to be massacred, they fled. There was a resistance for a time. There were wars going back and forth, but they decided to flee. They fled to Belgium. They fled to England. They fled to America. And so the loss of France became the gain of America. The best and the brightest leaving the country. And scholars agree, even if you don't like these stories, scholars agree that France has never recovered from what happened in France when it lost its best and its brightest. They fled the country. But they became famous Americans. George Washington, Huguenot on his mother's side. John Adams, second president of the Republic, Huguenot. Ulysses S. Grant, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft. Harry Truman, Gerald Ford, Lyndon Johnson, Paul Revere, DuPont, who founded DuPont Chemical, Warren Buffett, all of Huguenot descent, all who came to this country to escape, their ancestors came to escape persecution, the murder of their ancestors. That's why they ended up here. It's just historical fact, folks. It's also historical fact, and we're going to talk about this extensively this week, that the founders of this country were not followers of Augustine. You hear this history revisionism. I hear it. I'm going to show you a clip this week of a well-known politician talking about how the founders of America were followers of Augustine. That's false. The Pilgrims believed in liberty. They fled persecution. Now, there was a group of them called Puritans who were as intolerant as the people who they fled from. And we're going to talk about that this week as well. These two conflicting ideas which helped populate America. You had this group that was as intolerant as the people they fled from, and were very hard on people like Quakers. And we'll go through the history this week. But if you recognize the pictures of the men up there, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Madison, these men were not Puritans. They were not Augustinians. They believed in liberty of conscience. Madison is said to have seen the persecution for religious reasons, and it inspired him to write about it and push for the codification of religious rights in the constitutions of the states. Later, what became the Constitution of the United States. Let's go back into history, because the lessons of the past tell us what the lessons of the teach us what is coming in the future, especially if we forget. And unfortunately, we have forgotten. I am teaching you something that is historical fact this morning, and yet many of you have never heard it. Not because it's not true, but because it's been forgotten, but because it's been glossed over. This is the history of this nation, the Western world, and the reason we have the rights that we do today. In the 1500s, there was an index of prohibited books that was maintained by the Inquisition. By the Inquisition, which was the same Inquisition which would take a heretic and pull their fingernails out and take them and rack them and cut them into pieces and burn them at the stake in front of people publicly. This is the history. And this list of banned books was maintained for some 400 or 450 years formally. Possession of these books in some countries was enough to have you executed. It wasn't just the English Bible, although if you want to read a fascinating book about the English Bible, read a book called Book of Fire. It is about William Tyndale, who we're going to talk about here this morning. Book of Fire. The index was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. You look it up, historical fact, maintained from the 1500s all the way down to 1966. It included books by John Milton, Alexis de Tocqueville, John Locke, Nicholas Copernicus, who was an astronomer, Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Mis, Alexander Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers, David Hume, a philosopher by the name of Montesquieu, who we're going to cover later on this week, made some very important commentary about the separation of church and state and the importance of liberty of conscience. Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher and teacher, his tract on idolatry was on the list of banned books maintained by the papacy. Now, why was it on that list? It's because, of course, he's saying that according to the second commandment, it's a violation of the law of God to bow down to images. That's why it's on the list. John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, all on the list, and many, many others. Their books were gathered up and burnt. And so you have mass censorship. And friends, I want to tell you, this is a very important point for our day. I'm not up here for my health, telling you cunningly devised fables. The rights of this country come out of a history of bloodshed and censorship. And today we see the rise of censorship again. Censorship is all around us. In love, I would counsel you to shut your TV off, shut your Netflix off, and pick up your books. Go do research with respect to these things. We are inundated with entertainment, which keeps us from thinking about the days that we are living in and the crisis that is not just coming, it is on us. Go research the Twitter files and the censorship of social media instigated by government powers, YouTube, Google, Twitter, Instagram, government controlling the narrative that you are allowed to hear. This is the world that we live in. In the not too distant future, people who love truth are not going to have the internet to go to find it. There is a movement to bring back censorship, to suppress information. Over the course of the time of COVID, if you wanted to post a sermon on Twitter about some of the things going on, those sermons were taken down. Some of my sermons were taken down. My friends' sermons were taken down. Physicians who were raising the cry about certain inefficacies of lockdowns, taken down, censored, deplatformed. That is the spirit of the Dark Ages. We have to be able to have a dialogue. Otherwise, the marketplace of ideas dies. Whether you agree or you disagree with the people who were deplatformed, Jesus Christ never censored Lucifer in heaven. He let him speak. He lets him speak to this day because the truth will rise to the top. Censorship is wickedness. This list of books, 1564 to 1642, caught the works of Galileo, an astronomer, looking through his telescope at the night sky, wanting to write down what he saw, because at that particular time it was dogma that the earth was the center of the universe. And Galileo's looking through the telescope and he's saying, folks, I hate to tell you, the earth is not the center of the universe. The Milky Way is comprised of stars. Our earth is traveling around a sun. The other planets in our solar system are traveling around the sun. But this brought him into conflict with the church because the church said the earth is the center of the universe, and you will not teach otherwise. You will teach that the earth is the center of the universe, period. Galileo was tried by the Inquisition in 1633. He was found vehemently suspect of heresy, was condemned to house arrest, and he narrowly avoided execution for saying that the earth is traveling around the sun, which of course it is. We all know that now. Okay, it's common knowledge, or it should be common knowledge. I don't want to step on any toes. Should be common knowledge. The earth is traveling around the sun. Okay, you can look through a telescope and you can see it. His books were placed on the index of banned books. Heliocentric books, that's the idea that the earth is traveling around the sun, were banned. Galileo was ordered to abstain from holding, teaching, or defending heliocentric ideas after the trial. As I said, he narrowly avoided execution because according to legend, when Galileo was brought before the Inquisition, they said to him, "Are you willing to say that the earth does not move? That's what you have to do. We'll let you live. Just say the earth does not move." He was afraid for his life. So finally he said, "It does not move." And then legend has it that he said under his breath, "And yet it moves." But he still faced house arrest, and he died in imprisonment. In 1610, he wrote a letter to Johannes Kepler, "My dear Kepler." Now just listen to these words. These are the words of a man who paid the price, eventually, for truth. Just listen to the conflict. This conflict has lessons for us today. Listen to what he says to Kepler. "I wish that we might laugh at the remarkable stupidity of the common herd. What do you have to say about the principal philosophers of this academy who are filled with the stubbornness of an asp," that's a snake, "and do not want to look at either the planets, the moon, or the telescope, even though I have freely and deliberately offered them the opportunity 1,000 times? Truly, just as the asp stops its ears, so do these philosophers shut their eyes to the light of truth." So what is Galileo saying? He's saying the philosophers of the day hate me. They want to censor me. They want to deplatform me. They report me to the Pope and the Inquisition. I'm in trouble because of what I say. I'm saying to them, look through the telescope. No. We're not looking. No, look, here is the telescope. It's right here. Look at you can see the stars. Look through the telescope. No. No. We're not looking. We prefer ignorance and superstition to truth. Is that similar to our day and age? Have mercy. Here are the prophecies of the Bible, Daniel and Revelation. I have friends. I talk to them. Somebody said to me the other day, "You have friends?" Ha, ha, ha. Yeah, I have friends. I have friends. I talk to them. And I tell them, listen, does your church study Daniel and Revelation? No. Those books are closed books. Those books are closed books. Or, well, I just accept what my pastor says about them. Well, have you read them yourself? No, I haven't read them. Well, they're in the Bible. Don't you think it's important? Well, we just teach the New Testament. Have you studied the book of Revelation? It's in the New Testament. No, we don't study that. Why? It's a closed book. Have mercy. Look through the telescope. Have a look for yourself. It's your responsibility. Look through the telescope. It's right there. It tells you what truth is. It tells you what is going to come to pass. It tells you that the dark ages are going to be repeated. And we are on the verge of that crisis today. And instead we're watching Netflix. It's interesting that there were notable books that were not censored by the Inquisition. Notable books that were not censored. Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. A lot of people stop at that title. Okay? Charles Darwin was an advocate for eugenics. He was a racist. Charles Darwin's full title of his book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Stalin justified his eugenics positions on Darwin. So did Hitler. So does Mao. You really only have two choices. And this is the thing about this time period that we live in. There are only two choices. And the herd, listen, don't let me step on any toes. As far as Galileo says, I wish we could laugh at the common stupidity of the herd because they refuse to look through the telescope. Jesus says that Adam and Eve are real people. He says Noah is a real person. If you want to call yourself a Christian, you have to accept what Jesus Christ says. He's not a liar. Jesus says there was a creation. Jesus says he created male and female. These are truths according to the scriptures. The other side of the coin is Darwin. Another book that was not censored was the Communist Manifesto. So you're going to censor Galileo, but not Karl Marx. Why? We're going to talk about that this week. Why? Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, not censored. It was allowed. Never made it onto the list of books that were banned. Why? We're going to talk about some of these things this week. This man here is one of the greatest men in the last 600 years. And nobody has ever heard of him these days. This is the man. If you pick up a King James version of the Bible, we're going to come to that in a moment. He didn't translate the King James version, but we're going to come to his input and stamp on it. This is William Tyndale. He probably has gray hair in his beard because he was old before his time. He's much younger than I am now. He died at 42 years of age. He was strangled and burnt at the stake. Well, you think, well, he must have been a really bad man. I mean, what do we do? Who do we strangle and then burn these days? There he is, 42 years of age, burnt at the stake. He spoke at least 11 languages. He applied for permission from England to translate the Bible into the English language. This was what his dream was. Legend says that he had a debate with a priest, and they were talking about the need for the scriptures in the common tongue. And the priest said, we'd be better off without the Bible than without the words of the Pope. William Tyndale, legend says that he said, I defy the Pope. And if God will give me grace, I will make a common plowboy know more about the Bible than you do, to the priest. And so he set out on this goal. You young people in the crowd here today, do you have dreams? Do you have goals? Do you have things you want to accomplish? It's not too young to dream big for God. It is not too early to dream big for God. Tyndale's translations were the first English scriptures to draw directly from the Hebrew and Greek texts, not from a previous translation. He went to Europe. He spent the rest of his life translating the book that he loved into the language so that everybody could read it in his homeland. He had a crew of people who helped him because it's a massive task. On education, he said, they have ordained that no man shall look on the scripture until he is modeled in heathen learning, 8 or 9 years, and armed with false principles, with which he is clean shut out of the understanding of the scripture. There's a book that I highly recommend called The Place of the Bible in Christian Education by A.T. Jones. You can find it easily, relatively easily. It's online for free. But what Tyndale is saying is that the public education of the day wrecks a person so that when they come to this book, they're so full of false principles they can't understand it. When you pick up the English authorized, the King James authorized version, 84% of the New Testament and 75% of the Old Testament is his translation of the Bible. Phrases like, let there be light, the Passover, the salt of the earth, a moment in time, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. These are all William Tyndale's translations. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. In him we live and move and have our being. Speaking of Jesus Christ, who gives us all breath. This is all William Tyndale. He's one of the greatest men in the history of the last 1,000 years, I would say. And he gifted us with this book of fire. Do we read it? Do we cherish it? Do we love it? This is William Penn, young man born in England, and he left the Anglican faith and he adopted the Quaker faith. And at that point in time, there were very strict religious laws with respect to who could congregate and gather. William Penn was arrested for speaking to fellow Quakers. Get this, you were only allowed to have a gathering of a maximum of 5 people. All right? Just think about in the context of the time period that we live in and what we all just went through. Maximum 5 people. William Penn was preaching in the streets to a group of Quakers. There was at least 25 people there. He was arrested for preaching the gospel. They threw him in jail. He was preaching through the bars of his prison to the people outside. A jury was called, and they were told, you need to find this man guilty. Clearly, he had more people than 5 around him. The jury refused to convict him. The British magistrate arrested the jury and with William Penn threw them all back in jail. It is out of the history of this oppression that you get the right to assemble in the United States in the First Amendment. William Penn founded Pennsylvania because he wanted to have a haven to protect against religious persecution. Benjamin Franklin said, freedom of speech is a principal pillar of a free government. when this support is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved and tyranny is erected on its ruins. Republics and limited monarchies derive their strength and vigor from a popular examination into the action of the magistrates. What are magistrates? Those are judges. And what Franklin is saying is that republics derive their strength from a popular examination into the examination of judges, because judges are corrupt, or they were corrupt. And friends, they're still corrupt today. And increasingly we have censorship and restriction of information, and two castes in society where you have the powerful and you have the peasants. We are descending back into a feudal system. John Adams, second president of the United States, published anonymously a dissertation on canon and feudal law. Now, he published it anonymously because he would have gotten in trouble potentially for what he wrote. He had to publish it anonymously. And today there are people publishing anonymously online. And there is a move to tie everything that you post on the internet to your ID, your digital ID, so that everything you say, just like in China, will be subject to the scrutiny of the state using artificial intelligence. That's not conspiracy, that's fact. These are the days that we are living in. John Adams' dissertation on the canon and feudal law, 1772, he says basically, and I'm summarizing, I think that you should take a look at this. He says canon law is bad, that's church law, that's bad. Feudal law is bad, that's the law of like landlords and knights and lords, right? This is not a republican state, it's not a republic state where you have democracy. This is where you have a top-down control by the elite. But Adams said the worst of all is canon and feudal law, when you have the church and the state combining to control society. It is out of these things that you have the birth of America. America's not perfect, but it is the greatest country that has ever existed because of one reason. Because it preserves liberty of conscience, because it recognizes inalienable rights, because it's founded on principles of freedom. And as Americans, you should be concerned. We should be concerned. The Western world should be concerned because these principles are under attack. The First Amendment to the Constitution says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And people stop there, they say, well, this is the Establishment Clause. That's not all it says. Yes, it is in favor of a separation between church and state. Yes, it is. Despite what the naysayers today, the reason we know that that's the case is because William Penn was thrown in jail for preaching. He was not in favor of having religious zealots run the government, be they religious zealots of the left or the right. Madison wasn't either. Jefferson wasn't either. Washington wasn't either. But the First Amendment says more than this. It says no law shall be passed by Congress abridging the freedom of speech. So Congress cannot interfere with freedom of speech. That's why you have government elites commanding YouTube to take down content. They can't do it through Congress, or they shouldn't be able to do it through Congress. When a memo or an email gets sent from the White House to Google or to Twitter, it's being sent as a runaround, as an attempted runaround around the Constitution. No law shall be established restricting the press, peaceable assembly, or the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is the law that protects us. This is the law that protects your right to gather here this morning. Don't take it for granted. It is increasingly fragile, and it is the purchase of millions who laid down their lives. Today, the same power that censored in the past is calling for censorship again. That is a fact. This same power has met with all of the big tech CEOs and leaders, from Twitter to Amazon to Google to YouTube, Facebook, all of these leaders, politicians, the heads of companies. The president of Amazon was just over there recently. This is a fact. There is a movement afoot to take away your freedom of speech. It is a fact. Pope Francis implores public broadcasters to serve the common good and combat fake news. Serve the common good by restricting misinformation. It's the same thing that was happening in the Dark Ages. Galileo was accused of misinformation. That's how they censored him. Society has not changed. There are calls from prominent politicians demanding criminal charges for Americans engaged in propaganda. Is that this is the movement of the day. There's a movement for digital IDs. Here's a UN demand for global guidelines on internet speech to silence the insects thriving in the dark. And the insects are the same, that's a pejorative for the same type of people who love truth. Now, is there misinformation on the internet? Yes, and lots of it comes from the government. And from political parties. Americans will have to get fingerprinted and registered traveling to Europe from November. The world is changing, folks. If you want to go to Europe, do it before November this year. Judge stuns with ruling that children are too young for First Amendment rights. This is California. Elementary school is not a marketplace of ideas. Just think about what William Tyndale said. You got to get them early. Get them as early as possible. Make sure they think according to your plan. It's not a marketplace of ideas, thus the downsides of regulating speech there is not as significant as it is in high schools. Since there are no rights, the decision how to punish students will rest with the school. Is that American? This is the world that we live in. It is changing quickly. We need to be alive to the changes and recognize the historical realities that we live in and the similarities to our day and age. And most of all, we need to recognize that William Tyndale was killed to censor him. The martyrs were killed to censor them. Censorship is alive and well. When Abel was killed, it was because the final answer of all tyrants is force. And yet, their blood cries from the ground. Do you love the truth?